On paper, this was the single best division in the German army. Almost 20,000 men, nearly 160 tanks, the first unit in the whole Wehrmacht to be handed brand new Panthers and Tigers before anyone else got a look at them. They called it the Fire Brigade, because whenever a section of the Eastern Front was about to break, this was the division Berlin threw at the gap to hold it shut. By the spring of 1945, that division could field exactly 6 working Tiger tanks, 5 Panthers, 1 assault gun, and 1 lone Panzer IV. The proudest formation Germany ever put in the field had been ground down to a husk and pinned against the cold grey water of the Baltic Sea, with nowhere left to run. This is the story of how the Red Army took the most pampered, best-armed division in the German army and erased it, not in one dramatic battle, but with a machine. Concentrate the force, punch the hole, close the ring, cut the lifeline, then grind whatever is trapped inside until there is nothing left but a number in a casualty report. The division was called Grossdeutschland. Remember the name, because by the end of this, almost none of the men who carried it will still be alive or free. Let me take you back to before any of this happened, when that name still meant something terrifying. Grossdeutschland was not a normal division, and the German army made sure everyone knew it. It was the showpiece. When new equipment came off the factory lines, Grossdeutschland got it first, before the regular panzer divisions, before anyone. It was bigger than a standard division, better fed, better armed, and stuffed with experienced officers and long-service men. If the German army had a flagship, this was it. And there was a deliberate reason behind all that favoritism. The name itself, Grossdeutschland, meant Greater Germany. It was the army's own banner unit, the formation the High Command pointed to when it wanted to show what a German division could be at full strength. So the priority on the supply lists was not an accident. It was policy. The best men, the best tanks, the best of everything flowed to this one outfit on purpose, which makes what happened to it all the more telling. In late 1943, the troops earned a nickname that stuck: Die Feuerwehr, the Fire Brigade. Because every time a crisis flared up on the Eastern Front, every time the Soviets tore open a hole that threatened to swallow an entire army, Grossdeutschland got the call. Pack up, move out, plug the breach. They became the unit you sent when everything was already going wrong, and for a long stretch of the war, they were good enough to actually fix it. But there is a hidden cost buried in that nickname, and it matters for everything that comes later. A fire brigade is never in one place. It is always racing from one emergency to the next, never resting, never refitting properly, always thrown straight back into the worst fighting on the entire front. A division used that way burns through its veterans and its tanks faster than any unit sitting on a quiet sector ever would. The very thing that made Grossdeutschland special was also slowly killing it, one crisis at a time. By the middle of 1944, the division had teeth that almost no other German formation could match. On the 31st of May that year, the books showed 14 Panzer IV tanks, 90 brand new Panthers, and 40 Tiger ones. Add it up, and you get a single division swinging close to 160 tanks, backed by around 40 assault guns and roughly 20,000 men. That is not a division, that is a small army wearing one division's name. The man running it was Hasso von Manteuffel, who took command on the 1st of February 1944. Manteuffel was one of the rising stars of the German armoured force, the kind of officer who got noticed at the very top. Under him, Grossdeutschland was built up into one of the most heavily armoured formations on the entire Eastern Front. 1 battalion of Tigers, 3 battalions of Panthers. On paper, it was a monster. Manteuffel would not stay with it to the end, though. By the start of September 1944, he had been pulled up and away to bigger commands, and the division was handed to an officer named Karl Lorenz, who would lead it all the way down to the final surrender in May of 1945. So the man who built Grossdeutschland into a monster was not the man who had to watch it die. Lorenz inherited the showpiece right as the Red Army was preparing to take it apart. And here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. None of it mattered. Because in the summer of 1944, the entire German position in the east was about to fall apart in a way no fire brigade could fix. In July 1944, The Soviet summer offensive was rolling west like a flood, and the German line was buckling. The Red Army was now driving toward the borders of Germany itself, toward East Prussia, the old heartland of the Prussian military. This was not just any patch of ground. East Prussia was where the German officer class came from, the symbolic home of the army, the first piece of actual German soil the Soviets were about to reach. Losing it would be more than a military defeat. So Berlin needed its best unit, and it needed it now. In late July into early August, Grossdeutschland was pulled out of Army Group South Ukraine and rushed north into East Prussia and Lithuania. The mission was simple to say and impossible to do: stop the Red Army from reaching German soil. At first, the old magic seemed to still be there. In August, Grossdeutschland counterattacked into Lithuania and briefly retook the town of Vilkaviškis. For a moment it looked like the fire brigade was doing what it always did, slamming the door shut on a Soviet advance. But this time the door would not stay shut, and the cost was brutal. The division lost a heavy share of its tanks just holding ground and clawing back a few miles. And those tanks did not come back. A Panther knocked out near Vilkaviškis was a Panther gone for good, because the factories back home could no longer keep pace with the losses. Every local victory was being paid for with armor that could never be replaced. Then it got worse. Grossdeutschland was thrown into the fight to break through to the German 16th and 18th armies, which were getting cut off up in Courland. The division bled itself trying to keep that corridor open. Every attack chewed up more men and more armor that could not easily be replaced. The fire brigade was still fighting like a fire brigade, but the fire was now the size of a continent, and there were not enough hoses left. This is the moment to understand the trap that was forming. The Red Army was not just pushing Grossdeutschland back, it was setting up to surround it. By October, the German 3rd Panzer Army, with Grossdeutschland inside it, was strung out trying to hold the seam between two German army groups. Army Group Center to the south, Army Group North up in the Baltic. If the Soviets could punch through that seam and reach the coast, every German unit north of the cut, including this elite division, would be sealed off from the rest of the war. A seam between two army groups is always the weakest point in any defense, because neither side of it is fully responsible for holding it. The Soviets knew exactly where those joints were, and they hunted them. And the man planning exactly that was a Soviet general named Hovhannes Bagramyan. Bagramyan commanded the First Baltic Front, and what he did next is a clinic in how you destroy a stronger enemy without ever needing to be braver or better. Just smarter about where you put your weight. Instead of attacking everywhere, he did the opposite. He took up to half of his entire front and crammed it onto a single narrow sector, roughly a 12-mile stretch of ground, west of the town of Šiauliai. Half a front. One small piece of map. That is what concentration of force actually looks like. Think about the arithmetic of that for a second. On a 12-mile front, half an entire Soviet front means the attacker can stack tanks, guns and men so deep that the defender is outnumbered many times over at the only spot that matters. Everywhere else along the line, the Soviets were content to be weak, even outnumbered themselves, because those sectors were not where the blow was coming. All the weight went to the one place chosen to break. The Germans, spread thin, trying to hold everything, could not possibly match that density at the point of contact. They were strong nowhere because they tried to be strong everywhere. Against that hammer, the Germans had a thin crust, and the spot Bagramyan chose to hit was held by a weak German unit, the 551st, a Volksgrenadier division scraped together from whatever men could be found. A Volksgrenadier division was not a frontline fighting force in any real sense. It was a late-war improvisation, filled out with older men, recovering wounded, and rear-area personnel handed rifles. Bagramyan had not chosen that sector by chance. He had aimed his concentrated half-front directly at the softest piece of the German line he could find. On the 5th of October 1944, the hammer came down. The artillery opened first, and then the Soviet armies rolled forward into a sector that simply could not hold the weight. A Soviet offensive of this kind began with a bombardment so dense it was meant to physically erase the forward defences, churning the ground, cutting the wire, smashing the dugouts, and stunning whatever men survived before the first tank even moved. The weak German division in the path collapsed on the very first day. By the end of that day, the Red Army had torn a hole about 10 miles deep into the German line. 10 miles in one day. In the kind of fighting where a single mile could cost 1,000 lives, the Soviets had ripped open the front like wet paper. And Bagramyan had the force lined up behind the breach to exploit it. This is the second half of the method, and it is the part the Germans could never answer. It is not enough to make a hole. You have to have a fresh, fast, powerful force ready to pour through it before the defender can seal it. He poured the 5th Guards tank army under Volsky straight into the gap and aimed it at the coast north of the port of Memel. Behind and around it came a wall of Soviet armies, the 43rd under Beloborodov, the 51st under Kreiser, the 4th Shock Army under Malyshev, the 6th Guards Army under Chistyakov, and the 39th Army swinging in from the 3rd Belarusian front. Army after army, all funneling through the wound Bagramyan had opened. Look at that list for a moment, because it tells you what the Germans were really up against. 6 full armies, each one led by a hardened commander, all aimed through a single 12-mile gap toward one stretch of coast. Against that, the Germans had a broken Volksgrenadier division, and whatever could be scraped together behind it. There was no German reserve big enough to plug a hole that wide that fast. The math had already been decided before first flank reached open country. Within 2 days, the lead Soviet tanks reached the Baltic coast, and the moment they touched that water, the trap snapped shut. Think about what that actually meant on the map. The encirclement was complete by the 7th of October. Memel was now cut off, and it was not just Memel. The entire Army Group North, every German soldier up in that Baltic corner, had just been severed from East Prussia and the rest of Germany. One concentrated punch, 2 days, and a whole army group was hanging by a thread. And right in the middle of that closing ring sat the proud Fire Brigade, Grossdeutschland, the best division in the German army, now trapped in a shrinking pocket on the wrong side of the Red Army. If you are getting value out of this breakdown of how the Soviets dismantled Germany's elite, take a second to subscribe. We go deep on the Eastern Front every week, on the units, the commanders, and the operations that decided it. So here is where things get grim for the Fire Brigade, because this is where the legend of Grossdeutschland started to die. The division was packed into a thin coastal pocket alongside the 7th Panzer Division and the 58th Infantry Division. The Red Army was pressing from the land side, the sea was at their backs, and the only things keeping that pocket alive were not the division's famous Tigers and Panthers. They were 2 heavy cruisers and a sandbar. The cruisers were the Prinz Eugen and the Lutzow, part of a naval task force, sitting offshore and throwing heavy naval gunfire into the Soviet attackers. Understand what those ships could do. A heavy cruiser's main guns fired shells far larger than anything a tank or a field battery carried, and they could reach miles inland from the safety of deep water. When the Red Army massed its men and armour in the open to launch an assault on the pocket, those naval guns could drop a curtain of high explosive right on top of the staging area and tear the attack apart before it ever reached the German lines. The shellfire came in with a shriek the infantry on both sides learned to dread, and where it landed, whole assembly areas simply ceased to exist. That naval fire, more than anything Grossdeutschland's own tanks could do, was what kept the perimeter from caving in. The proudest armoured division in Germany was being held alive by the Navy. And the lifeline, the only physical connection to the rest of East Prussia, was the Curonian Spit, a long, thin finger of sand running down the coast. Picture it, a strip of dune and pine barely wide enough to matter, with the open sea on one side and a shallow lagoon on the other. Everything that came in or went out, every shell, every ration, every reinforcement and every wounded man had to thread along that fragile strip. Cut it, and the pocket was finished. The whole survival of an elite division now hung on a sandbar that a determined push could have severed. So here is the bitter truth about the most heavily armoured division in the German army. In the Memel pocket, its Tigers and Panthers were not winning battles. They were a rearguard. The division used what armour it had left to cover the retreat of other German units pulling back into Memel, buying time with tanks that had been built to spearhead grand offensives. Think about the waste in that. These were machines designed to lead breakthroughs, to smash through enemy lines at the head of an attack. Now they were parked in defensive positions, dueling Soviet guns and dying one by one, just to keep an escape route open for somebody else. The fire brigade had been reduced to standing in the doorway, holding it open just long enough for everyone else to get out. For several days the division was effectively surrounded, and the only way out was not a breakthrough, not some brilliant armoured counterstroke. It was the sea. The German Navy began evacuating the trapped units across the water, hauling them out of the pocket by ship. There is a hard symbolism in that. The division that had always been first in line for the newest tank, the unit built to attack, could not fight its own way out of a single coastal pocket. It had to be carried off the beach. Grossdeutschland was loaded onto ships, badly mauled, and dropped at Pillau, a port further along the coast. It was pulled out of the line entirely, and the worn-out 95th Infantry Division was shoved in to replace it. Read that again. The best division in the German army had to be relieved by an ordinary infantry division, because it had been beaten down to the point where it could no longer hold its own piece of front. But the Red Army was not done with East Prussia, and it was not done with Grossdeutschland, because while the Memel pocket was being squeezed, another Soviet front was hammering the door from a different direction. While Bagramyan was sealing the coast, the Third Belarusian Front under Cherniakovsky launched its own attack straight at East Prussia. This was the Gumbinnen Goldap operation, running from the 16th of October to the 5th of November, 1944. The goal was to smash through the fortified German border defences and open the road toward Königsberg, the old Prussian capital. This was the first time in the entire war that the Red Army was attacking onto German soil proper, and both sides knew the weight of that. The Germans had spent months turning the border zone into a belt of trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank ditches, determined that the enemy would not set foot on Prussian ground. And here you see what had happened to the fire brigade. By this point, Grossdeutschland was no longer fighting as a single, concentrated, war-winning division. It was being fed into the fighting in pieces, as ad hoc battle groups, patching one crisis after another. The unit that had been designed to hit as one massive armoured fist was now scattered into fragments, each one plugging a different hole. A few tanks here to retake a village, a battle group there, to shore up a collapsing regiment. The whole concept of the division had been broken apart by the simple math of too many emergencies, and not enough men. An armoured division only delivers its real power when it strikes as a whole, all its tanks and infantry and guns hitting one point together. Split into a dozen little fire teams, even an elite division becomes just a scattering of strong points, dangerous locally and decisive nowhere. The Soviets took Gumbinnen on the 22nd of October. The Germans, throwing in armour and heavy Tiger units, managed to claw it back on the 24th. The Soviet 31st Army grabbed Goldap on the 28th in a surprise attack, and the Germans retook it again in early November. On that border, the German defence held for now. The offensive was beaten back, and for a moment the High Command could tell itself the line had stabilised. But notice what that defence cost, and how it was done. It was done by burning up exactly the kind of elite armoured strength that Grossdeutschland represented, spending it in scattered counterattacks just to hold a line that was already doomed. Every Tiger committed to retaking a border town was a Tiger that could not be replaced. The Germans were winning local fights by spending an asset they could never get back, while the Red Army could afford to lose ground, regroup, and come again with fresh formations. That is the whole story of the Eastern Front in one operation. The Germans could still win a town. They could not win the war of replacement, and replacement was the only war that mattered now. Behind every Soviet army that was bled at Gumbinnen stood another forming up to take its place. Behind every German Tiger that was lost stood an empty factory schedule. Which brings us to the number that tells you everything. By the 15th of March 1945, after the Memel fighting and everything that followed, somebody counted what was left of Grossdeutschland's armour. The division that had once fielded close to 160 tanks now had this: 1 assault gun, 1 Panzer IV, 5 Panthers, 6 Tigers, 13 armoured vehicles. From a division built around 3 battalions of Panthers and a battalion of Tigers, down to 13. Hold those two pictures side by side. In the spring of 1944, this was 160 tanks rolling forward as a single armoured fist. Less than a year later, it was 13 machines, barely enough to equip one weak company. And the men, around 4,000 of them, out of a peak of nearly 20,000, 4 out of every 5 men who had worn the Grossdeutschland name were gone, killed, wounded, captured, or scattered. The fire brigade had been burned down to its own ashes. And the Red Army was about to put out the last embers. The Great East Prussian Offensive opened on the 13th of January 1945, and this time there was no holding it. The Soviet armies tore the German defence apart and drove it back against the coast, shattering it into isolated pockets, clinging to the shore around Königsberg and the Samland Peninsula. There was no front line anymore. There were just shrinking islands of German troops with the sea behind them, and the Red Army closing in from every other direction. The same method that had worked at Memel was now being run across the whole province at once. Concentrate, break through, drive to the sea, and split the defenders into pockets that could be reduced one at a time. The remnants of Grossdeutschland, those 4,000 survivors, got swept up into this collapse. The division, or what was wearing its name, was folded into a corps alongside other wrecked formations: the battered 95th, the 93rd, the 14th Infantry, and a Volksgrenadier division, all of them shadows of what they had once been. A corps on paper. In reality, a collection of survivors with almost nothing left to fight with. When you have to staple 5 broken divisions together to make one functioning corps, you are not commanding an army anymore. You are managing a collapse. They ended up at Pillau, the port at the tip of the Samland Peninsula, the very last Wehrmacht stronghold in East Prussia. Around 4,000 men of Grossdeutschland, surrounded near Balga, managed to cross over to Pillau, and there they dug in for the final stand. The same division that had once been sent to break Soviet offensives was now just trying to hold one harbour for a few more days, not to win anything, just to keep the escape route by sea open a little longer for the soldiers and refugees still streaming toward the coast behind them. The scale of the killing in those final weeks is hard to take in. The Red Army claimed roughly 80,000 German troops killed or captured in the Samland operations alone. Across the whole defence of East Prussia in 1945, German losses ran to something like 150,000 killed or missing. These were not the numbers of a fighting retreat. These were the numbers of an army being destroyed where it stood, pressed into ever smaller pockets along the shore until there was no more room to give, and no more ground behind them but salt water. And then came the end at Pillau. On the 25th of April 1945, the Soviet 11th Guards Army stormed the area. The last German stronghold in East Prussia was cleared in roughly 12 hours. 12 hours. The fortress that the remnants of Germany's proudest division were defending fell in half a day. After months of being run ragged, after holding the doorway at Memel and bleeding white at Gumbinnen, after dragging itself across to Pillau for one last stand, the position the survivors were defending was overrun between one sunrise and sunset. What happened to the men carrying the name Grossdeutschland tells you how complete the destruction was. Only around 800 of them managed to get out, ferried across the Baltic away from the slaughter, packed onto whatever boats could still reach the harbour under fire. Those 800 survivors surrendered to the British in Schleswig-Holstein on the 9th of May. 1945, the day after the war in Europe officially ended. 800. Out of a division that had once counted nearly 20,000 men and the best tanks Germany could build. The rest were dead or in Soviet captivity. The fire brigade, the unit that always got the first new Tiger, the showpiece of the entire German army, was effectively erased from the face of the war. So let me bring this back to where we started, to that gap between the reputation and the result. Grossdeutschland had everything the German army could give it. The newest tanks before anyone else, the most men, the most experience, a name that was supposed to mean it could not be beaten, and none of it changed the outcome by a single day. Because the Red Army was not trying to outduel Grossdeutschland tank for tank. It did not have to. Bagramyan and the Soviet commanders ran a process. They concentrated overwhelming force on one narrow piece of ground. They picked the weakest unit in the line and aimed the hammer right at it. They punched a hole that the elite division was nowhere near in time to plug. They drove fresh tank armies straight to the sea and closed the ring. They cut the lifeline down to a sandbar and 2 cruisers, and then they let the trap do the work, grinding the pocket smaller and smaller until the proudest division in Germany was 13 tanks and 4,000 exhausted men waiting for the end. Elite status bought nothing once the unit was outnumbered, scattered, and pinned against the water. All those Tigers and Panthers, all that priority on the supply lists, and the division still ended its war as a rear guard on a beach, evacuated in pieces, replaced by ordinary infantry, and finally wiped out at a harbour that fell in 12 hours. The Soviets did not just defeat Grossdeutschland. They proved that the whole idea behind it, the idea that you could win by building one unbeatable super division, was a fantasy. A single brilliant division can hold one gap. It cannot be in 6 places at once. It cannot replace its own dead. It cannot stop an enemy who chooses where and when to strike and brings overwhelming weight to that one spot every single time. Against a machine that could concentrate, encircle and replace its losses without end. The Fire Brigade was just one more division on the wrong side of the math. If you want to see how the Red Army took apart another so-called elite German formation, the video on screens breaks down exactly that. Go watch it next.